Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Thanks, Don, and welcome everyone to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. My guest today is Richard Wakeman of Microsoft, so welcome, Richard. I do want to remind the audience that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our focus as a managed service provider is primarily on organizations seeking certification, and that's who we have in the audience today for the most part. Audience members, please do send any questions that you do have during the session. I'll try to work in as many as time allows. This has been a very popular topic, and we've gotten a lot of questions ahead of the session, so I can't promise to get to all of them. I'm sure we won't. Let me start with the introduction of Richard. Richard Wakeman is the Senior Director for Aerospace and Defense for Azure Global at Microsoft. He specializes in the defense industrial base adoption of cloud services. If you've Googled Microsoft and CMMC together, you've likely read Richard's blog posts. He joined Microsoft in 2007 as a developer, identity and messaging expert at the dawn of Microsoft's online services. He's also worked in Exchange Product Group, leading cloud deployments, and has been a senior architect guiding customer journeys to the cloud. So very knowledgeable, sort of the authoritative voice on CMMC and Microsoft. So very, very happy to have you here with us today, Richard. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's very honored to attend.
So this session today, I think, will be probably more sort of vendor specific, product specific than most of our sessions, because we're going to dive into the details of Microsoft's CMMC strategy. The concepts, though, I think are applicable to other cloud services. So I'm trusting that this session is valuable to our audience, even for those who are not using Microsoft cloud offerings. Our audience today, as I mentioned, mostly organizations seeking certification, very large percentage of which are Microsoft customers. We definitely get more questions about Microsoft 365 as it relates to CMMC than any other vendor specific question. And I think this is in part because there's a large market share, obviously, from Microsoft, also in part because there's a lot of choices that we need to sort out. So I'm really excited to have you here today and help illuminate these choices for us. So thanks very much. Let's start with the basics. So Microsoft 365 has public cloud and community cloud versions available. Just start us with an overview of those so we can kind of level set on the terminology. I know we all kind of shorthand, commercial, GCC, et cetera, but just give us a quick lay of the land and then we'll dive into some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. As you can imagine, this most prevalent question that we get, especially from defense industrial bases, looking at which cloud service offering from Microsoft best aligns the requirements that you have, especially around data protection requirements that you have for U.S. Department of Defense and other regimes. And it used to be a really simple decision matrix. When we first introduced our government clouds about a decade ago, it was really, if you were a U.S. government customer, it's likely that you would choose a U.S. government cloud and everybody else would go on premises, right? Or go into the commercial cloud or stay on premises. If you look at over this journey, we've now introduced the ability for government contractors to also have eligibility into the government clouds. So that would include the defense industrial base. And we also have evolved to enable a number of scenarios in our commercial cloud, as well as even introduce data sovereignty and sovereign clouds as well. So the way I like to break it down oftentimes in this discussion is to really differentiate between a concept of data residency versus data sovereignty. So if you think about data sovereignty, this is really in alignment with requirements that you get with QE specified, things like export controlled data that is in compliance with, for example, the Department of State DDTC for export controlled data, or even nuclear information and other requirements that would have citizenship and data center requirements for the continental United States. So naturally, for data sovereignty, you would have requirements for data at rest only within the continental United States, as well as networks that were restricted to CONUS. That includes data processing and, of course, service personnel. So we've got for example, a citizenship check for the service personnel that we have managing the back-end systems. all that together give you a solution where we can have a contractual obligation on the back end for example, those ITAR and those requirements for data sovereignty. Now, on the other side of the equation, you have data residency. So if you look at that, it would be that you could, in the commercial cloud, both for Azure commercial regions, as well as even with Microsoft 365, select where your data is stored at rest. So for data residency in the commercial cloud, you can select US regions. However, if you look at the commercial side environment, it does have a global network, right? So if you're connecting, for example, from, let's say, Australia into our global network, you may have an entry into our global network in Australia, which may also introduce data processing outside the continental United States, or OCONUS. So that's a big difference, right? And you also have for example, the service personnel, we have a follow the sun support model within our commercial cloud offering. So it really does restrict us from being able to have that contractual obligation for things like ITAR and data sovereignty requirements. Now, if you look at the difference between like Azure Commercial versus Azure Government, that's more on the infrastructure as a service and platform as a service side of the house. Naturally, you get data residency in Azure Commercial. Our Azure Government is offering the full sovereignty, right? So you get in Azure Government, we even go up to, for the DoD Security Requirements Guide, an IL5 set of requirements that include citizenship, et cetera. For Office 365 and specifically the Microsoft 365 product suite, we've got the Microsoft 365 Commercial. Of course, it's paired with Azure Commercial. And then on the data sovereignty in the sovereign cloud, we have Microsoft 365 Government GCC High, right? And GCC High is naturally paired with Azure Government. So the combination of GCC High and Azure Government make our US sovereign cloud. In the middle, we do have what we often refer to as our GCC Moderate. That's very specifically software as a service, and it is our Office 365 platform that was really built primarily for state and local government and federal civilian agencies. And you'll find that it is actually paired on the Azure Commercial platform. So it really does restrict us from being able to have data sovereignty obligations. So for GCC, we of course couldn't offer an ITAR amendment on those clouds. So we'll of course, as we go through our conversation, unravel these in a little bit more detail.
Sure, and we'll dive in a little bit in terms of how that intersects with CMMC. Data sovereignty is not per se a concept within CMMC. It's a concept of the kinds of data that you might store and process in there. So, those all interplay in the choice. So before we dive into the how people might choose one or the other, I want to sort of fly a little higher and look at the role of cloud computing in a contractor's overall compliance picture. So we get questions from folks that are along these lines. If I purchase cloud service X, let's say GCC High, will I be compliant? And moving to the cloud definitely shifts some of the compliance burden to the cloud provider, but it doesn't shift all of it. Give us a little bit of background on how you at Microsoft view the compliance responsibilities between Microsoft and the customers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the other big topic that we get quite frequently is, okay, assuming that I do make, the first question, which cloud do I go into? Assuming that I make the right choice, am I suddenly, magically compliant with CMMC level 3 and GCC High, right? From that perspective, I would say that it's always a shared scope of responsibility. In fact, if you look at the way that the control sets are articulated with, for example, NIST 800-171 and even CMMC practices, that it puts the onus on the customer, right, to demonstrate compliance with those, for example, CMMC, and in which case, it is not only a shared scope of responsibility, but it really puts you in the driver's seat of making sure that you use the cloud platform and you can be able to demonstrate how you're inheriting those controls, which of course we have a vested interest in making sure that we can help accelerate you to compliance. But from that perspective, it will really largely depend on which cloud service that you are consuming. For example, if you look at hosting a virtual machine on Azure infrastructure as a service, you'll have a much larger scope of responsibility on the customer to demonstrate compliance as compared to if you get into more of the software as a service security suite, like with Microsoft 365 and of course Office 365. The putt is certainly shorter because you will transfer and ultimately shed a lot of the IT service management responsibilities over to Microsoft. So from that perspective, there's still a wide scope of responsibility for the customers that we can still assist you with. By way of example, if you look at one thing that resonates really well with a lot of my customers is access control, right? So from an access control perspective, we're going to manage all the IT service management part of that for you. Who has the authority to enter our data centers or to log into our host operating systems. All that's going to be managed by Microsoft. But we're not going to necessarily dictate to you how you are going to protect your data. So it's your responsibility to set up access control so that only authorized people have access to your data, and that you enable things like multi-factor authentication, et cetera, in correspondence with your requirements for NIST 801-71 in particular. If you look at the other angle to it is that by virtue of the fact that, that Microsoft scope of responsibility is something that is a known quantity. For example, we go through the audit process and we get authorizations for FedRAMP and for cybersecurity frameworks, et cetera, that it does help you to demonstrate compliance by using a cloud service platform, because you get to inherit what is the known set of system security plans from the cloud service provider.
So in addition to what you may do as a cloud provider and what the customer may do, there's Microsoft partners, including us at NeoSystems, that offer managed services that would supplement those security controls that come from the cloud. And you touch on this in some of your blog writing, that you may be able to augment what Microsoft provides with other services and therefore get to a compliant state. So for example, one of the things that we do at NeoSystems is we'll manage the configuration of the cloud tenancy on behalf of our clients. So we take that burden from the client, but we're not shifting it to Microsoft, right? We're in the sort of intermediate role. We also, for example, may collect and manage some activity logs of the customer's use of the cloud platform. How do those sort of services fit into that overall compliance picture from your perspective?
Yeah, if you look at, for example, the CMMC acceleration program that we've constructed in order to help, provide an accelerated path to compliance, a big part of that is working with our managed service providers, knowing that, of course, many of the small, medium-sized companies of the world out there have less formal IT departments, many of which don't even have a formal like CISO that would manage their security policies, et cetera. So it's a great opportunity to shift a lot of that customer scope of responsibility over to the managed service provider. And that's really where we've been leaning in, in terms of being able to provide a platform that gives scaffolding, if you will, to the managed service providers. So let's just say just natively Microsoft can help you get half of the way there for compliance and contributing to the intent of over 50% of the controls. It still takes somebody that would work with the customer to help them migrate to the cloud and make the right configuration choices, may have reference architectures that are repeatable at scale, that would be unique to, for example, your organization. And it would ultimately also play well for reducing costs across the ecosystem, because as opposed to each one of these individual companies, especially the small, medium-sized companies, having to go to recruit and train cybersecurity professionals, especially get up into CMMC level 3 and above. I mean, imagine trying to construct a SOC, right, on your own from scratch. That would be less than tenable for most organizations. So they'll rely on managed service providers Also looking at scale, it's like, for example, I've seen a lot of small companies end up in situations where they have like incident response and they're trying to figure this out for the very first time. It is less than trivial for you to do something that's less common, and it may be very disruptive to your business, as opposed to your organization that would have that IQ built in, and you do it at scale with many customers, so you know how to navigate that process for incident reporting and so forth.
Cool, thanks. That's good insight. So let's dive into the sort of compliance alignment a little bit. So for organizations that are seeking certification under CMMC, the top question that I see is around if and how specific cloud offerings are going to comply with CMMC. So the simplest version of that goes like this. Is it true that Microsoft 365 commercial is an automatic fail for CMMC? Like, that rumor is floating around out there. I don't know exactly where it started, but I've heard it a number of times from different sources. And the answer to that question is a lot more nuanced than sort of a simple yes or no, right? So, but before we go into CMMC, I want to kind of think about first some of the regulations that are already in place that people are already complying with or needing to comply with. So let's kind of take it one step at a time and kind of work our way up. For a contractor that only has federal contract information, FCI, they have to comply with the FAR clause, that 52204-21. How might that contractor evaluate choices between commercial, GCC, GCC high, given that they have just the FCI that they need to protect with those 15 items that are in the FAR clause?
Yeah, and it's going to largely depend on the organization. Of course, if you look at FAR 21, it's much broader than just the defense industrial base. So we'll encounter that with a lot of our other customers, especially those government contractors that work with other federal, civilian, or cabinet level agencies. In terms of looking at those 15 safeguarding requirements that you have for FCI, those, you're able to demonstrate compliance for FCI in any one of our clouds, right? And a lot of that has to do with, of course, looking at your alignment for being able to demonstrate compliance, things like NIST 800-171, and given by virtue that all of our clouds, for example, Azure and Microsoft 365 commercial, even government, all follow a similar scheme, control scope across all those clouds based on NIST 853, which is what we implement for FedRAMP. So naturally, you can be able to demonstrate compliance with NIST 800-171 in commercial, as well as our government cloud. So if you're looking for that binary decision matrix and all you'll ever have is a requirement for FCI, you can do that in any of our clouds. I typically pivot that conversation though and ask them, is that all that your future holds for you? I mean, is there any opportunity in the future that you may actually get a flow down from, a prime contractor, if you're a sub, that would require you to have DFAR 7012? Well, that changes the game altogether, right?
Right. So let's go to that next. Let's go to 7012 next. So that would be the next tier, right? Is a company that has some controlled unclassified information, some CUI, and therefore, if they're a defense contractor, they've got the DFAR 7012 clause. That clause requires that cloud services be FedRAMP moderate equivalent, and it has some specific incident reporting requirements. So all the Microsoft Cloud versions that you mentioned all have FedRAMP moderate. Some of the Azure things are high, I guess, right? But they're at least all FedRAMP moderate. How might a company evaluate choices between commercial, GCC, GCC high, assuming that their intent is to store and process CUI, where they've got to comply with that DFAR 7012 clause?
Yeah, and this is where it really begins to introduce additional requirements that may drive you into a government cloud, right? So if you look at that requirement for FedRAMP, I'd like to hone in on that for just a minute though, because there's a lot of assumptions that people make from just by virtue of having a FedRAMP authorization or equivalent in a cloud that is providing you with some, for example, oftentimes there's an assumption that just by being FedRAMP that there is a citizenship requirement for that cloud to be compliant, right? So, if you look at a lot of customers that come to us and they ask, hey, I'm looking for whether or not Microsoft's commercial cloud is FedRAMP authorized. My question back to them would be, in many cases, why are you asking? Right? Because if you're not a federal agency that actually has to go through an authorization themselves for a FedRAMP, you would as a commercial company, like a defense industrial base company, have additional requirements above and beyond FedRAMP. And that's where you get into DFAR 7012, especially with cyber incident reporting, subparagraph C through G, that we cannot do in the commercial cloud within Microsoft 365 commercial, that would drive you now into a government cloud. From that perspective, we could also go into a whole dialogue around protecting controlled and classified information, right? So that's where you end up with that data sovereignty requirement. So in certain categories of QE specified in particular, you would have above and beyond FedRAMP, you would have requirements, for example, for compliance with like ITAR data, which is really a set of controls that's dictated by the Department of State as opposed to the DoD, right?
So you mentioned this a second ago, the flow downs, the incident response flow downs. So let me ask about the flow down of DFAR 7012 specifically. So if the contractor is using Microsoft Cloud as a general support system, sort of the typical back office corporate use, some legal experts that we've had on this series have said that Microsoft would generally not be considered a quote unquote subcontractor on their government contracts. So what's been your experience? Are federal contractors, DoD contractors, I guess specifically, that are using Microsoft 365, Office 365 for general purpose computing, are they asking for a DFAR 7012 flow down? Like, they all have it in their contracts, right? So are they asking for a flow down, or generally not, showing you to be in that subcontractor status?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a frequent one as well. If you look at DFAR 7010 and 7012, just simply the use or consumption of a cloud service provider cloud offering does not require flow downs, right? It's really more where you're repackaging or bundling the use of cloud and a service that you're reselling to the government is where you get that introduction of flow downs. In fact, I would say of the last half decade since we introduced GCC High, I've yet to see more than just a couple of flow down requirements today. Well, we make it simple. There's a DFAR's attestation letter that we provide. It's simply 2 pages that we can provide to you on request. And I've given it to more people than actually need the flow downs, just because it does show, and I'm getting ready to blog a lot more on this detail next week, actually, around how it is that we meet those DFAR C through G subclause, because that is a question, especially in a shared scope of responsibility, that customers often have on what their requirements are around ensuring that their DFAR 7012 using our cloud product, where it really falls on them to demonstrate compliance with it.
Kind of a follow-up question. It's an audience question. Maybe paraphrase a little bit, but there's a requirement in DFAR 7012 for incident reporting by the contractor, and again, they're required to flow that down to subcontractors, but probably not Microsoft typically. So the question was around, if self-reporting is required for being hacked, and if Microsoft 365 on the commercial or versions where you're not accepting those flow downs and not meeting the C through G reporting requirements, does that make you non-compliant in any way, right? Is that a situation where you feel like you have some latitude to not report that? It's sort of an internal hack, even though your clients may have a responsibility to report things that would involve data that they've stored there. I don't know. That's a tough one to sort out. Obviously, when you've accepted a flow down, you would report under the C through G, but where you haven't accepted it, say in commercial, cloud, presumably you would not.
Yeah, it's, I would say this falls right in line with what we've been really setting as a common theme, is that it's a shared scope of responsibility. I would offer that not only are we fully compliant with incident reporting, responsibility, especially in our government clouds, that would, be our Microsoft scope of responsibility, but you also have a broader spectrum of different types of events that we manage and have scope for beyond what is specifically defined in DFAR 7012C through G. But it really depends on the context, right? So if you look at, like a denial of service attack, et cetera, we may be able to pick up and of course be able to notify our customer of a certain incident, but we don't have necessarily context of what the data impact is because our service personnel do not have access to customer content. So from a shared scope of responsibility, whenever an incident occurs, it would be the customer responsibility, of course, to look at that damage assessment impact of the event and what data is of course in scope to determine if it's something, for example, needs to be reported. If it's lunch menus or whatnot, it may be, of course, less concerned as compared to if you were, of course, have export controlled data. So from that perspective, even for service level events, it's still shared scope for the customer to go and look at how those events would be ultimately monitored or reported back. And then there's of course many events that could happen that are completely outside of Microsoft's visibility. If through access control you give somebody access to your data and your tenant, and that could constitute a breach, then it's solely your responsibility to, of course, to monitor for that and to report it back.
So let me ask a question about the ITAR data you mentioned before. So this is data that's on the U.S. munitions list. It's restricted in terms of its ability to be disseminated to foreign countries. Many defense contractors have it. So sounded pretty clear that in the GCC high realm, you offer full data sovereignty. So with U.S. citizenship checks on your support staff, et cetera. So that would be a clear choice for ITAR data. What about GCC for the ITAR data? You've got then the data residency covered, but my understanding is there may be support staff, other folks who are not U.S. citizens, but you just mentioned a second ago, they wouldn't have access to client data. So if I have ITAR data, could I store that in GCC as long as I control who has access to that data? Does Microsoft do anything that would mess that up from a data sovereignty perspective?
Yeah, I'm very passionate about this topic. In fact, I wrote a whole blog article on, does QE require data sovereignty? From our perspective, there's multiple different categories of CUI. Naturally, not all require data sovereignty. Many do. Of course, the ones that are the crown jewels, oftentimes those would be more export controlled or other QE specified data types that would specifically require data sovereignty. And the only way that Microsoft is going to provide you for a contractual obligation on the back end is by virtue of the cloud that we built that was specifically designed to protect controlled unclassified information. That is our sovereign cloud with Azure Government and Microsoft 365 Government GCC High. And even Dynamics is another product, Dynamics 365 GCC High as well. Doesn't mean that you could not demonstrate compliance in GCC or even in commercial. With ITAR data, for example, Department of State DDTC did come out with an update to their ruling that allows for an encryption carve out. If you have FIPS 140-2 validated encryption library and you have encryption end-to-end on that data before it's stored within the cloud, then you may be able to adequately demonstrate compliance. But it's untenable for most, especially when you start getting into a whole program that would introduce your collaboration system, right, with email and file storage and various other things, because we all know that QE is not well marked. I would say probably more so ITAR data is better marked, but if you're creating ITAR data as a company, then naturally you can't rely on the DoD to mark it for you. or if you get enough of data in one location, it may have to be upgraded automatically to be, ITAR or export controlled. In which case, it may be untenable for you to have an end-to-end encryption scheme that's going to work for you outside of the U.S. sovereign cloud, especially if it's already there and you find out afterwards that it's ITAR data and you do not have it encrypted in the appropriate fashion. Well, now you have a data spill, right?
Got it. So, we're running up to the end of our time, and I want to work in a couple more questions. So I am going to run over, if that's okay, and hopefully the audience has the latitude to be able to stick around and hear some of these answers. This is a fascinating conversation. So I want to ask kind of a CMMC compliance question. I'm going to use an audience version because it's really direct and to the point. Audience question is: we must satisfy DFAR 7012 now, and we'll seek CMMC level 3 as soon as practical. We have no requirements for ITAR or for flow down to Microsoft. Our understanding is that we don't need GCC high for this case. Is that correct? Can we reasonably meet all the requirements in the commercial cloud, or is it better for us to migrate to GCC?
So I like to pivot the conversation and say, okay, if you, at this point in time, if you do not require data protection of ITAR or any other data that would have citizenship requirements or data sovereignty requirements, then yes, you could demonstrate compliance with CMMC level 3 within the GCC environment. If at any point in the future your business evolves to, or you may decide to enter into more of opportunities, right, where you may introduce requirements for example, ITAR data, I can say that it's less than trivial to migrate from GCC to GCC high. In fact, it can be very expensive and very disruptive to your business to do that migration. So make the decision very carefully. If you are confident that you would never have any ITAR data, or you can manage it through compensating controls, and GCC certainly could meet those requirements. I just say be very careful, because in the future, if you do have to migrate, it's quite an ordeal.
And I think, key point being that some clients already are in the commercial cloud or GCC and are contemplating whether they need to move as a result of CMMC. Other clients may have not done any cloud adoption, so they're looking at moving from an on-premise. It's a whole different choice, right? Because for the folks that are already in the cloud, they have to bear that migration cost. I would hope that migration gets easier as we progress forward in time, not harder, right? That you guys will make that process, less challenging in the future than it is today. So at least it won't get any worse. Say it that way, right?
Well, one thing I found is it used to be easy to migrate back in the days when all we had was Exchange and SharePoint and some VM workloads, right? We've added so many different services now to the cloud platform that, migration, especially when you start introducing device management on the platform, can be less than trivial. And that's true today. We will do some things, and a lot of our partners that we work with help to ease that burden. But once you have, like, for example, all of your devices and your people paired to a specific service, it just becomes much more disruptive if you need to migrate from one to the other.
I want to ask just one last CMMC question, and then I'll go to a wrap up. Okay. So we know that Microsoft's been in discussions with CMMC officials. So they've mentioned it. Actually, the government officials have mentioned it about things about certification inheritance. So for people that are looking to buy services from Microsoft, there's this question of, what can we count on, right? And so you've been moving ahead and putting out some guidance on CMMC compliance, helping people understand how to use those products. Is there any indication of how the government will confer, or if they'll confer, any kind of official status on those offerings? Is it just going to be a CMMC certification that you'll take your offerings through the CMMC process and get them certified, or is there something else? Is it reciprocal to FedRAMP, other things that are in the works in terms of how we will know what we can and can't rely on, and again get that vetted by someone other than your statements, marketing statements?
Oh yeah, and there's a bit of mystery still left here. The program of reciprocity that would be established for CMMC is really more around looking how OSCs could be able to take existing certifications that they have achieved, like with DIBCAC and so forth, and apply it so that they have less redundancy in terms of what it is that they need to do to get through a CMMC audit. That's less clear for cloud service providers, so we've been really leaning in and providing some leadership on that front. One thing I'd like to do is just make sure that we kind of have a line of demarcation between this requirement that Microsoft will have to get CMMC certified, which we do, but that is more for our own DoD business, right? So I call that Microsoft, the Federal Services Integrator, right?
Okay.
So Microsoft, the FSI, in our own internal systems in support of our contracts, things like Premier support, right? Or where we are priming or subprime for government contracts, then we're going to get CMMC certified, in the process of doing so today. For our products, so that's Microsoft, the CSP, right? For the CSP, your only requirement for us is in terms of looking at DFAR 7012 in particular, is to have a FedRAMP moderate or equivalent cloud offering. And of course, if you've got a DFARS requirement, DFAR 7012, then you also, as we talked about, need the DFAR 7012 C through G requirements as well. Now we know that this is, leaves much more of the requirements on the customer for demonstrating compliance with CMMC. So for us to really help to accelerate or shorten that path to compliance, we are going through the whole process of doing an audit as if we're going to certify the cloud product, the CSP. Although we don't have to, we will generate that documentation that would show, what the customer scope of responsibility is, especially for covering those 20 extra practices for CMMC level 3. And we'll provide an attestation letter for CMMC, not unlike what we have for DFAR 7012.
Thanks. We are way over our time, so I'm going to ask just a quick wrap-up question, and then we'll close it out. So as a wrap-up, I like to always ask for one suggestion for the CMMC program, or more specifically, how we're all reacting to it, that would make things work better. So I'm sure in your position, you've talked with hundreds, maybe more, certainly hundreds of DoD contractors for whom Microsoft is part of their CMMC compliance strategy. What's your one suggestion to all of us on how we could be smarter in how we're handling CMMC and in the cloud?
Yeah, I'd say it's an extension to what we were just talking about in terms of looking at how customers are able to demonstrate compliance on a cloud service provider platform. That the program of reciprocity, and specifically what can be inherited from the cloud service provider, is still something that needs to be established. One thing I like to point out is that, if you look at the underlying cloud service provider, by virtue of us having a FedRAMP authorization, we are able to demonstrate compliance with NIST 853, which is a superset of controls compared to CMMC level 3. But they do not directly map into CMMC in terms of looking at practices, especially the additional 20 practices I was referring to before. So from that perspective, I would say to improve the language that's used for NIST 800-171 and for CMMC, so that it can adequately be able to take cloud into consideration, and to define what is inheritable from the cloud service provider. And at the same time, we're working and leaning in on that front. For example, working on training for C3PAO auditors, so that they can become more familiar with the cloud platform, what to look for, making sure that we have the right level of documentation that Microsoft can provide that can feed into those audits, so that they're not asking every customer the same questions over and over again. But until that really is established, especially going through this provisional period, I think it's going to continue to be a journey, right, to understand how that is orchestrated.
I agree. And as consumers, we all want to, we we don't want to audit the same thing over and over, and we want to be really sure in our purchasing choices. So, Richard, thanks very much. This was excellent, excellent conversation today. Took an extra 10 minutes or so from everybody's day, and I hope it was valuable. I want to thank you. I want to thank our audience for joining. Please join us next week. We are doing this town hall session every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. So next session will be Wednesday, February 24th. Our guest will be Harvey Rishikoff. He's a legal expert and director of policy and cybersecurity research at the University of Maryland Applied Research Laboratory for Intelligence and Security. Should be an interesting conversation. If you have not gotten an invitation for that, please visit our website for the registration details. It's neosystemscorp.com. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.